Hey all. After talking about cellular reproduction and the various mechanisms of cellular death, it only makes sense to transition to discussing cancer because cancer, by definition, is uncontrolled cellular reproduction or the failure of damaged cells to undergo the process of apoptosis. Cancers are categorized, and in general, cancers are categorized by their tissue of origin. So remember when we were talking about human development, we said that one of the first things to happen as we transition from a morula into a blastocyst is we generate different cell layers. Ultimately, the human embryo divides itself into three separate layers: the ectoderm, the endoderm, and the mesoderm. Cancers are categorized based upon whether they are derived from ectoderm or mesoderm. Ectodermal tissues develop into carcinomas, and mesodermal tissues develop into sarcomas. So you guys have probably heard those words before, carcinoma and sarcoma. And essentially what they mean is what tissue or what layer of tissue did these cells arise from, or did this cancer arise from? Again, carcinomas arising from epithelial tissues and sarcomas arising from mesodermal tissues. Carcinomas, those that arise from epithelial tissues, are further subdivided based upon their function in the epithelial tissue. Remember, there are two general functions of the epithelium. One is to provide some sort of barrier, and the other is to secrete things. If your cancer arises from a secretory cell, your carcinoma is described as an adenocarcinoma. So on this table, there are a list of some very common types of adenocarcinoma. Adenocarcinomas, again, are derived from secretory epithelial cells. Squamous cell carcinomas, on the other hand, are derived from epithelial tissues that are meant to have that barrier function, so just create the lining. There are, on the right side of this table, a few non-adenocarcinoma / non-squamous cell carcinoma types. They're odd epithelial cells, so they give rise to odder epithelial cancers or carcinomas. Sarcomas are those that are cancers that arise from mesodermal tissue, and some, I'll say, air quote, common sarcomas are listed in this table. I put that in air quotes because sarcomas are not nearly as common as carcinomas. You may have heard of some of these sarcomas, however, osteosarcoma being a cancer of the bone, a liposarcoma being a cancer of adipocytes or fat cells, and leiomyosarcomas being actually quite rare, but cancers of smooth muscle cells. As I said, carcinomas are much more common than sarcomas, and the relative rates of cancer in various tissues in males and females are listed in this image. But we believe that there are a couple of reasons for the overwhelming abundance of carcinomas relative to sarcomas, and that has to do with the fact that epithelial cells or epithelial tissues in general divide much more frequently. That is because your epithelial tissues are constantly sort of replenishing themselves. So you slough off skin cells, for example, and you need to fill in those areas with new cells. So you need to continually make new skin cells, or you need to continually make new gastrointestinal cells. And so those continual division cycles of the epithelial cells, each time you divide, it's possible to make some sort of error, and those errors may be responsible for at least some of the carcinomas. Another reason that carcinomas are hypothesized to be much more frequent is that your epithelial tissues are much more vulnerable to exposure to some sort of chemical mutagen. Mutagens are chemicals that generate DNA mutations, and those DNA mutations are responsible for the development of cancer. And we'll talk more about that in the next video. There are a couple of other very common cancers, or relatively common cancers, that don't fall under either the carcinoma or the sarcoma category. And among these are blood cancers. Blood cancers are divided into leukemias and lymphomas, and there really is no distinction. Sometimes they're called leukemia, sometimes they're called lymphoma, but in either case, these are cancers of blood cells. Leukemias and lymphomas can derive from cells that are either of myeloid origin, and those are sort of shown on the left part of this developmental tree, or they could be derived from lymphoid precursors, and those are shown on the right side of this developmental tree. You've seen this before when we were talking both about stem cells and about the immune system. Here are some very common blood cancers. A word that we use to describe blood cancers, blood is hematopoietic. So these are hematopoietic cancers or hematopoietic malignancies, so blood cancers. There's lymphocytic leukemia and there's myelogenous leukemia. Both of those are leukemias. Obviously, lymphocytic leukemia is derived of lymphoid origin, and myelogenous leukemia is derived from that myeloid origin. Some cancers that are common in younger people include Hodgkin's lymphoma and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Those are on this list as well. Nervous cancers, nervous tissue cancers, are also not categorized as either sarcomas or carcinomas. Here we have a list of the various nervous tissue cancers. You'll see that some of them are cancers of actual neurons, but the vast majority of them are cancers of the glial cells, both in the central nervous system and in the peripheral nervous system. Again, these are not categorized as either carcinomas or sarcomas, but are rather in their own category of nervous tissue cancers. So what causes cancer? Well, we've spent a little bit of time talking about the human papillomavirus, or HPV, and how it can develop or cause the development of cervical or other reproductive cancers. There are other viruses, hepatitis viruses, cytomegalovirus, or HIV, that are also associated with the development of specific types of cancers. But I don't want anyone to fall into the trap of believing that the majority of cancers are caused by viral infection, because in fact, cancers caused by viral infection are very rare. Those that we know of are listed on this slide. The vast majority of cancers are caused by alterations in the genetic code or alterations in the way that our cells use genes. So it's possible, although unlikely, that we would inherit a genetic mutation that would give us some sort of predisposition to develop cancer. Inheriting a single DNA mutation only very, very rarely will result in the development of cancer. Exposure to environmental mutagens, so things that change the DNA sequence, is very often associated with the development of cancer. Similarly, exposures to things in the environment that change the way that we use our DNA, so not changing the DNA sequence, but rather changing the way we use DNA, can also lead to the development of cancer, but we would say that gene utilization differences are epigenetic changes. So not genetic changes, but rather epigenetic changes in our DNA utilization. So we've spoken about the categorization of cancers and the causes for cancers. I'll stop here and in the next PowerPoint, we'll talk about the development and progression of cancer and how we might minimize our risks of cancer.